It's a small group. In some ways it might be good because when we have a question and answer session at the end, I'd love to hear what you guys think about this topic, transfer climate, that I'm going to talk about today. Because I think it's a pretty new way of looking at things in second language education. So I'd like to hear if you guys make any connections to context that you're working in. That'd be great. So yeah, thanks again for coming. I know it's right near the end of the conference, and the numbers are sort of dwindling a little bit here. My name's Mark James, and I'm an assistant professor in the English department at Arizona State University. And I teach courses there on and do research on second language teaching and learning. By the way, can you hear me okay? Okay. And in today's presentation, I'm going to talk about one of the studies that I've worked on recently on the topic of transfer of learning in higher education ESL. I'll spend the next 30 minutes or so describing the details of this study, beginning with the background, then the research design and the findings, and finally the implications of the findings for research and for teaching practice. And then we'll have time for some questions. And again, I'd like to hear any connections that you guys can make to this topic would be great. Also, let me point out that I don't have a handout, but I will put the presentation slides, the PowerPoint slides, and a recording. I'm recording my presentation. I'll put both of those on my website. My faculty website at Arizona State University. There's the site. You can also get to it just by going to the English department at Arizona State University and finding my name in the list. I'll put this up at the end as well, so you can jot that down if you like. Oh, and one more thing. An article about this study, you can also find that. It's just come out in English for Specific Purposes, the English for Specific Purposes journal, the most recent issue of that as well. Okay. So to begin, a little background. First, this study rests on an assumption that English for academic purposes education aims to help students develop English language skills that they will use in their other academic courses. This very practical goal is connected to a theoretical construct called learning transfer that has been the focus of a lot of research in educational psychology. Learning transfer occurs when learning in one context or with one set of materials impacts on performance in another context or with another set of materials. Now, in some education contexts, assumptions might be made that if learning occurs in the classroom, learning transfer out of the classroom will automatically occur too. For example, if students show on an in-class test that they can solve various math problems, we might assume that those students can apply those skills when they're out of the classroom too. For example, when they go shopping. The problem is that a century's worth of research has demonstrated that such learning transfer is not inevitable and can in fact be very difficult to stimulate. But research outside second language education has identified various factors that can influence learning transfer. For example, learning transfer is more likely when a person perceives two situations as being similar, or when a person is motivated to transfer learning. The study I'll be talking about today, though, focused on just one factor, called transfer climate, which is the support for learning transfer that a person feels in the target context of instruction. And I'll explain this in a little bit more detail over the next few slides. Transfer climate is a term that originated in research on workplace training. This research has typically involved looking at the support that workers feel for learning transfer when they have finished some kind of work-related training and are back in their regular workplace setting. More specifically, the research has focused on workers' perceptions of support for learning transfer from their supervisors, co-workers, and supervisees, as well as the workers' perceptions of personal outcomes that might result from learning transfer. As you can see here in point A, the support from supervisors, co-workers, and supervisees involves expectations that training will be applied in the workplace, a demonstration of the skills and knowledge covered in training, encouragement to apply training in the workplace, attention to connections between the workplace and training, positive reactions when training is applied in the workplace, and positive attitudes towards training. And that's all from the supervisors, co-workers, and supervisees of the trainee. So the idea here is that, for example, if a worker at a company receives some kind of training and then returns to the workplace where the supervisor then asks about the training and points out ways that the worker might apply the training and tells the worker that it would be a good idea to apply the training and demonstrates those training outcomes him or herself, this would all contribute to a positive transfer climate, in which case it would be more likely that the worker would actually transfer learning. Adding to that is point B, which has to do with the worker's perception of relationships between learning transfer and personal outcomes like salary raises and promotions. If a worker who has received training thinks that applying that training in the workplace will lead to a raise or a better position, then the transfer climate is positive, and it's more likely that the worker actually will transfer that training. Of course, the transfer climate can also be negative. For example, if a worker's supervisor and co-workers say negative things about training, or they don't use the training outcomes themselves, or they even ridicule the worker for trying to transfer training. Or if the worker, him or herself, thinks that transfer won't lead to raises or promotions, or might even lead to negative outcomes like a longer workday. These perceptions contribute to a negative transfer climate, in which case it's less likely that the worker will actually transfer the training to the workplace. Transfer climate hasn't yet been applied in the study of EAP education, but I thought it might be worth trying this for a few reasons. First, like workplace settings, the mainstream academic settings targeted by EAP instruction are places of work. In other words, coursework. And students do have to deal, for example, with supervisors and co-workers, but in the form of teachers and classmates. Also, these mainstream academic settings can be complex, and it's not difficult to imagine there being hurdles to learning transfer. For example, EAP students might have to interact with other students who are overly competitive, or who have negative attitudes toward the course material, or towards the course instructor, or who claim that it's not necessary to spend much time working on assignments. Or the EAP students might have to interact with instructors who pay little attention to communication skills. These kinds of interactions could in turn have an impact on the student's behavior in those mainstream academic settings. In particular, whether the students actually transfer the language-related skills that they've been developing in the EAP course. Also, there's a lot of interest among EAP educators in understanding the mainstream academic settings that students have to navigate. A large body of needs analysis research has identified the language-related needs of ESL students. For example, by looking at the kinds of tasks that students have to carry out in mainstream courses, or looking at which skills, reading, writing, speaking, or listening, students have to use the most. Also, there's a growing body of research looking at ESL students' broader experiences in mainstream academic settings. For example, by looking at their interactions with native English-speaking classmates and with instructors. With this in mind, a transfer climate lens would help EAP educators to see mainstream academic settings from a new perspective, that of learning transfer. So a transfer climate perspective has potential to complement existing research on EAP education. So, building on that background, I designed a study to examine the applicability of the transfer climate construct in EAP education. Adapting the definition of transfer climate from workplace training literature, I viewed transfer climate as learners' perceptions of characteristics of their mainstream academic courses that may facilitate or inhibit the application of learning outcomes from an EAP course. And with that definition in mind, I focused on this research question. What can a transfer climate perspective reveal about challenges EAP students face in a mainstream academic setting? To answer this question, I gathered data in the fall semester of 2007 from students who were taking an EAP writing course at a large urban research-oriented university in the U.S. This EAP writing course was a sheltered version of a one-semester, three-credit freshman composition course. That semester, the course had 8 sections with up to 19 students in each section. I was able to invite students from 5 of these sections to participate in the study. I taught one of those sections, and 2 other instructors taught 2 sections each. We didn't plan or teach the course collaboratively, so there were some differences obviously between these sections. For example, the specific in-class activities that were used day to day. But important aspects of the sections were similar. First, all sections of this course shared a common goal, which was to prepare students for the writing that they would do in their university studies. Also, all sections were required to have 4 main writing assignments, and each of these was a 3 to 4 page essay involving self-reflection, like describing a memorable person or event in their lives, or some kind of primary or secondary research, like profiling a building on campus. The assignments had to involve multiple drafts, meaning the students were expected to write rough drafts, which would be reviewed by peers and or the instructor, and then revise those rough drafts to produce final drafts. The total number of students who participated in the study was 52. Most of these students were in their first year of study at the university, but as you can see on this slide, there was variation in terms of gender, nationality, and major area of study. To gather data, I interviewed each of these students once near the end of that semester. These interviews were semi-structured, and they were designed to address the students' perceptions of a variety of features of their mainstream academic courses. These features were meant to parallel the components of transfer climate that I had read about in the workplace training literature. But instead of asking about support from supervisors and coworkers, I asked about support from instructors and classmates. And instead of asking about personal outcomes like salary raises and promotions, I asked about personal outcomes in the form of higher grades and improved work efficiency. And as you can see here, the support that I asked about included whether instructors expect strong writing skills or react positively to the use of skills from the EAP course, and whether classmates are concerned about writing, and whether instructors and classmates use the same kinds of writing skills practiced in the EAP course, or whether they talk about connections between other courses and EAP courses, or whether they encourage the use of skills from EAP courses in other courses, or have positive attitudes towards EAP courses. And when the students gave answers to each of these questions, I always asked for detailed explanations. For example, if a student said that instructors in mainstream courses do expect strong writing skills, I asked the student to explain how he or she knew that. In other words, was it based on something the instructor had said? or something other students had said, or something else that had happened in class. And I asked for explanations like that for each of their answers to these questions. So what you see on this slide here was the basic structure of the interviews. And these interviews ended up ranging in length from 23 minutes up to 76 minutes, with an average of about 45 minutes. I recorded the interviews so I could later transcribe them for analysis. And that analysis involved two steps, which I'll describe now. First, I analyzed the transcripts quantitatively to look for patterns across students in perceptions of supportive and unsupportive aspects of transfer climate. So I looked at each of those main interview questions and I coded the participant's answer as either yes, no, varied, don't know, or unclear. For example, for the interview question, quote, do your instructors in other courses expect students to have strong English writing skills? If the student's answer was clearly positive, I coded it as yes. And if it was clearly negative, I coded it as no. And if it was mixed, like you can see in the example after the first bullet up there, where the student said yes for some instructors but no for others, I coded it as varied. If the student said that he or she did not know, I coded it as don't know. And if the student's answer wasn't clear enough for me to feel confident putting it into one of the other categories, I coded it as unclear. After I coded all the students' transcripts like this, I calculated the percentages of students in each response category to get an idea of how common it was for these various aspects of transfer climate to be supportive or unsupportive or mixed. The second part of the analysis was qualitative, and I did this to look more deeply at the students' perceptions. I identified the reasons that participants gave for any unsupportive aspects of transfer climate, and I coded these reasons into categories. For example, if a student said that she thought instructors in other courses don't expect strong writing skills, and then explained that she knew this because she made grammar mistakes in lab reports, but never lost any points for these mistakes, I coded it as no connection between language use and grades, which you can see at the bottom of the screen. And by repeating this procedure with each of the reasons that students gave in their answers, I built up a list of features of these mainstream academic courses that appeared to be contributing to an unsupportive transfer climate. And just before I move on to describing those findings, I'll point out that I checked the reliability of these analysis procedures by first having another researcher recode about 25% of the data using all the same categories that I had used, and second, by recoding about 25% of the data myself using all those same categories about 1 month after I had done the initial coding. In both cases, the degree of agreement with my initial coding decisions was in the 90% range, which I took to be an acceptable degree of reliability. So now for the findings. The quantitative analysis of the data showed that transfer climate for these EAP students could be supportive. But this varied across students and across the specific aspects of transfer climate. As this table shows, for some students, transfer climate was supportive, and for others, it was less supportive. And we can see that, just for example. In the top row, we can see that while 17% of the students reported that all of their instructors expected students to have strong English writing skills, 48% reported that only some of their instructors had such expectations. And 31% reported that none of their instructors had such expectations. So we see variation across the students. And we can see in the table that some individual aspects of transfer climate, when we look up and down, some individual aspects of transfer climate were more supportive than others. For example, adding together students in the yes column and the varied column, we can see in the middle of the table that 72% of the students thought that at least some instructors would have a positive reaction to transfer. Also near the bottom of the table, we can see that 95% of the students thought that transfer would lead to higher grades in at least some of their other courses. So these were the relatively supportive aspects of transfer climate. But other aspects were less supportive. For example, 89% of the students said that none of their instructors pointed out connections between those instructors' courses and EAP courses. And 94% said that none of their classmates pointed out connections between other courses and EAP courses. So overall, the data in this table showed that the supportiveness of transfer climate varied across students and across specific aspects of transfer climate. Now that was part of the picture, and the findings from the qualitative analysis shed a little bit more light here. As I mentioned, I looked in the interview transcripts at the reasons why, in some cases, students perceived the transfer climate to be unsupportive. In other words, the reasons behind all the numbers in the no column in this table. And those reasons fell into 9 categories, which I'll briefly describe one by one. The first category is explicit negative reference to EAP courses. Some students explained that their classmates in mainstream courses had made negative comments about EAP courses, like saying that the courses were boring or difficult or a waste of time. For example, in the excerpt on this slide, this student had said that some classmates had negative attitudes towards EAP courses, and here gave an example of what those classmates had said. Next, students also sometimes explained that they had heard classmates or instructors make negative comments about academic writing in general. This included complaints from classmates that academic writing is not enjoyable or is unimportant, and comments from instructors that writing quality didn't matter for particular assignments, or, as the excerpt on this slide indicates or illustrates, to apologize for asking students to write. Next, in some cases, participants referred to classmates' effective language use, commenting that that language use was really good or it made sense, or that their classmates' sentence structure was better than their own. For example, as you can see on this slide, this student said classmates were not concerned about writing skills, and then explained that those classmates write easily. But in other cases, students referred to ineffective or careless language use of classmates or instructors. For example, pointing out that classmates or instructors made grammar mistakes, or wrote as quickly as possible, or seemed to make little effort. For example, here, this student had stated that some classmates did not have positive attitudes towards EAP courses, and explained that those classmates had put little time into their work. That was the indicator to that student. Next, some students explained that the quality of language use had little or no impact on grades in their mainstream courses. The students sometimes said that written work accounted for a small proportion of the final grade in a course. Or, more often, they said that when they or classmates handed in weak quality writing, or made little effort with their writing, they didn't lose any grades. For example, this student had stated that instructors did not expect students to have strong English writing skills, and explained here that the instructor had not penalized the student's own grammar mistakes. Students also sometimes referred to differences between the kinds of activities they did in their mainstream courses and the kinds of activities they did in their EAP course. They explained, for example, that in some mainstream courses, activities involved limited amounts of writing, like on short answer tests, or involved informal types of writing, like postings on electronic bulletin boards. For example, this student said that transfer from the EAP course could actually lead to lower grades in other courses, because the courses were different in terms of writing styles. Number 7. Some students pointed to a general disconnect between the EAP course and other disciplines. The disciplines that students referred to as unrelated to the EAP course included music, engineering, and science. Those are the ones they explicitly mentioned in the interviews. The student in this example had said that classmates were not concerned about writing skills and referred to those students' major area of study, in this case architecture, that was the 4th one, in the explanation. In other cases, students explained that their mainstream courses had large numbers of students or limited time, both of which have to do with resources. For example, this student referred to a shortage of time in an explanation of why classmates were not concerned about writing skills. And finally, in several cases, students gave reasons that included reference to the level of a course, pointing out that a course was introductory rather than upper division or advanced. For example, this student said that instructors in mainstream courses did not expect strong writing skills from students because these were introductory level courses. So those were the findings of the quantitative and qualitative analyses of the data. And based on those findings, I concluded that a transfer climate perspective can shed useful light on challenges that EAP students face in a mainstream academic setting. First, we saw that for each of the individual aspects of transfer climate examined in this study, like instructors' expectations for students' writing and classmates' concern with writing, there were at least some students who found them supportive. And this suggests that EAP students can perceive support for learning transfer in a variety of ways. But we also saw that for each of the individual aspects of transfer climate, there were some students who found them unsupportive. And this suggests that EAP students can also feel a lack of support for learning transfer in a variety of ways. And second, we saw that there were various concrete features of this mainstream academic setting that contributed to the students' perceptions of an unsupportive transfer climate. For example, negative comments they heard about academic writing or about EAP courses, or a disconnect they observed between their grades and the quality of their writing. So these features, these concrete features, might then be added to the list of challenges that EAP students can face in mainstream academic settings. The findings from this study are important in a few ways. First, by focusing on students' perceptions, this study complements research that has examined the challenges ESL students face, but from other perspectives. For example, research that has looked at faculty perceptions of students' difficulties, or research that has focused on assignment prompts that students have to deal with, or research that has examined students' actual performance. In relation to other research that has examined students' perceptions, this study is useful because it looked at a relatively broad range of features of a mainstream academic setting. And that helps provide context for findings in other studies. For example, other research has shown that ESL students in mainstream courses often see speaking and writing as difficult, in particular achieving grammatical accuracy or using appropriate academic style. The findings in this study suggest that when students are dealing with those kinds of difficulties, they may not be receiving a message that learning outcomes from an EAP course might help. Also, this study examines students' perceptions of a mainstream academic setting, specifically in terms of support for learning transfer. And this provides a new angle for investigating students' experiences interacting with others in mainstream courses. For example, other studies have shown that ESL students might view interactions with instructors or classmates as uncomfortable, or might perceive classmates as being different from themselves in terms of background knowledge and values, or might perceive classmates as being uninterested in what the ESL students have to say. The findings in this study draw attention in a new way to an important impact that these kinds of interactions or these perceptions of interactions might have. The students may not feel support for transferring learning from EAP courses to those mainstream courses. As for implications for teaching practice, these findings help provide EAP educators with a picture of challenges that students can face in mainstream academic settings. It looks like an important point to come out of this is that when students have opportunities to apply learning outcomes from an EAP course in other courses, those opportunities don't occur in a vacuum. They occur in situations that may vary in terms of the support that students perceive for transfer. So some students from an EAP course might find themselves in other courses where they perceive little in the way of support for transfer. And if transfer is going to occur in those situations, the students have to be able to overlook this apparent lack of support. With these possibilities in mind, EAP educators may want to assess transfer climate and perhaps share the results of their assessment with their students and help their students decide how to react in situations where the climate is unsupportive. This study does have limitations, some of which can be addressed in future research on this topic. For example, the data were gathered only through interviews with students, and it's impossible to be sure that those self-reports match the students' actual perceptions. But since transfer climate by definition involves students' perceptions, a focus on self-report data may be the only way to carry out research directly on transfer climate. But it might also be interesting to examine transfer climate from different angles. For example, to see if, when EAP students perceive an unsupportive climate, do instructors and other students in that setting perceive the same thing? Or do classroom observations and analyses of instructional documents fit with the EAP students' perceptions? The primary concern in transfer climate research has to be the perceptions of the individuals who are expected to transfer learning, which in this case is EAP students. But answers to these other questions might be useful to EAP educators who want to raise students' awareness of transfer climate. Second, in terms of data analyses, this study was limited in that it involved searching for patterns across one group of 52 students. And it didn't look at any subgroups, for example, based on level of study or major area of study. It's possible that students in some subgroups could have different perceptions than students in other subgroups. In this sense, the number of students in this study was small. So future research might be conducted with larger numbers of students so that these and other subgroups can be compared and contrasted from a transfer climate perspective. In any case, the general purpose of this study was to examine the applicability of the transfer climate construct in EAP education. And this construct does appear to be applicable here in the sense that it can effectively shed light on the experiences of EAP students in mainstream academic settings. And the picture revealed is particularly meaningful. In other words, research might investigate ESL students' perceptions of mainstream academic contexts in various ways. But a transfer climate lens can direct attention to those perceptions related to a central goal of EAP education, which is transfer of learning. And to conclude, besides addressing the limitations of this study, as I described on the previous slide, future research might build on this study by systematically examining the relationship between transfer climate and actual transfer of learning. For example, investigating whether a supportive transfer climate correlates with more learning transfer, and an unsupportive transfer climate correlates with less learning transfer. And also looking at how this relationship might vary across different EAP settings. This kind of research would build fruitfully on the study that I talked about here today and would contribute to the development of EAP-specific models of transfer climate and learning transfer. So that's all I have, and I'd be happy to hear any questions or comments. And as I mentioned, in case you're interested in notes or anything, I'll put all this stuff on my site, and there's the address right there. Please, yeah.
The students that you were talking about, the EAP students, but the other students,
Yeah.
they were giving input about the quality of the EAP class. Were those former EAP students, or were they
Which students are you thinking of? I'm sorry.
Well, in some of the quotes you had, no. In one of your statistics you had that there was that the students felt that there was no support from other classmates.
Right.
But was that from the general university population or just from former?
No, that was from students in their mainstream courses. So I was asking them about, so the students in my study were taking the EAP course. During that semester, they were taking an EAP course plus 3, 4, or 5 other courses, engineering, business, you name it, across disciplines in their major. And I was asking them about what was happening in those courses. So when I asked them about classmates, I was asking them about, do the students in your engineering courses and your business courses, do your classmates in those courses encourage or, ask them a few questions about it. But for example, do they encourage you to make use of things that you've learned in the EAP course?
How would the average university student even have a clue about that?
Yeah, it's a good question. Interestingly, though, some students said yes. Right? They're small numbers, but some students said yeah. What I was trying to do here was, take this construct, which, all the research on transfer climate so far has been done in workplace settings. And as I looked at this and read about this, because it's in a general area that I've been doing research on, I thought this sounds like it has some application. I don't know how well it's going to fit here, but it has some application. So I tried, I worked with the ideas about transfer climate in the workplace training literature, which included things like, does a trainee in a workplace setting, when they come back to the workplace, do their coworkers encourage them to make use, because they might have gone and had training by themselves, not with their coworkers. They've had some training by themselves. Do their coworkers encourage them to make use of things that they've learned in that training? And that's what they looked at in the workplace training literature. And I thought, well, I'm going to take this model and just see what happens when I apply it. And I wondered as well, so are any students going to say that their classmates have encouraged them to make use of things they've learned in writing courses? And most of them said no, but some said yes. A small number said yes. So that was kind of interesting to see what they were talking about. One student, I didn't include any quotes for this, but I can remember a student telling me that it was in some group work, involved in doing some group work in a course, like I think working maybe on a lab report in a chemistry class, something like that they had to do together. And and this student from the EAP course felt like one or several of the students in the group were quite supportive of him or her using skills that had been developed in the EAP course, because they were sort of pointing things out when they were writing the draft and talking about it in different ways. So I was interested in how I didn't assume that that a student would feel encouragement in one specific way. I wanted to ask them, do you feel like you're being encouraged by your classmates? And if so, what does that look like? Because to me, encouragement might be classmates saying, "Hey, why don't you make use of skills you've learned in your EAP course?" Which sounds kind of strange. I wouldn't expect that to happen. But I wanted to know what the students thought, and a few of them said, "Yeah, I do feel like my classmates really encourage me to do this stuff."
From the university I teach in, I know that there's a real lack of knowledge about what goes on inside of the EAP program.
Oh, right.
So
Gotcha.
I think it would be, can't expect instructors to really encourage students because the instructors don't necessarily support the program themselves.
Yeah. I from different contexts I worked in, I would say the same thing. So one thing that I was hoping would come out of this was that some of these things that maybe that I've had I had anecdotal
evidence of, that, I don't think that instructors in some of the contexts I've worked in, I don't think that mainstream course instructors know much about what's going on in EAP courses. Those are the things that I've observed anecdotally, but I was hoping that, maybe doing things a bit more systematically might show, how common is that? And what we saw was that, for example, the encouragement aspect of the transfer climate. Do your instructors encourage you to use things you've learned from the EAP course? And do your classmates encourage you? But that encouragement was very uncommon, right? But some students thought it was there, which was kind of interesting. But it wasn't uncommon, and I suspect it's related to that sort of disconnect in a lot of contexts that we might be familiar with. But so what I'm hoping is that this just sort of brings out some of these things that we've seen anecdotally.
Do you have any? This is a little disheartening. Do you have any sense that the students' perceptions match reality?
That's next. That's what I.
You need to really hold or survey the state of the teachers in the classes in which they're in. They still affect the student. Like
exactly. Right.
But
we want to see that as well, right? Because I think there's a few things to be done to build on this, and you're absolutely right. Let's see if this is what our EAP students in this context are seeing. Let's see what's happening from our perspective. Let's go in and watch some classes and look at materials and talk to other students and the instructors, because that raises some interesting questions. If the EAP students are perceiving things in a certain way, what's happening from other perspectives? Does it match? Is there anything we can do about it? That's another question worth sort of doing some research on, to see if the students have these perspectives. Is there anything that we can do in an EAP course to work with that? Raising students' awareness of what's happening in mainstream courses, to talk about it a bit more, so that maybe to help them deal with those situations if it creates a problem. I think that's probably one of the important questions to follow up on this as well, is to see what actually happens with learning transfer. Just because students perceived a lack of support in some ways, I don't assume yet that means that they're not transferring learning. I know that there are some problems, because I've been doing a series of research studies on learning transfer in this kind of setting, and there's all sorts of interesting things coming out of that, the gaps and the lack of transfer in ways that we might expect it, things like that. But it is happening. I do see transfer happening in the different studies I'm doing, but it's probably not as much as a lot of us would like to see. So that's the next thing. I want to connect the perceptions of transfer climate to learning transfer and see. It wouldn't surprise me. I'm sure that some students are transferring learning despite these perceptions of a lack of support. I don't think that support for learning transfer, from what I've seen in several studies, I don't think that's I don't think it's necessarily a requirement or necessarily sufficient for learning transfer to happen. But it'll be interesting to see how it's connected to actual learning transfer.
How much interaction is there between the EAP instructors and the mainstream instructors in terms of helping each other? Kind of transfer.
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't looked into that systematically yet, but through doing this and other similar studies, I haven't. We have in this institution there are some of the freshman writing courses are being taught in a learning community model. So there is some work together between the composition or EAP instructors and the mainstream course instructors, but I think those are still some pretty small numbers at this institution. So some, but it doesn't look like a lot, and that would be worth having a look at systematically as well, and to see what impact that might have on this stuff, right? Does working together, collaborating, have an impact on students' perceptions? Please.
So you said in some of your previous research you've done that you found some pretty interesting things that students are transferring.
Yeah.
Such as?
I've looked at transfer in a few different ways, and let's see. transfer from an EAP writing course, a freshman EAP writing course. And one of the studies I did, I looked at the textbook that they've been using in their EAP course and identified as many of the explicitly targeted learning outcomes that I could find in that textbook. And then I gave them a writing task to do, which mimicked the kind of writing that they would do in their other courses and looked for whether they were applying those skills on this other writing task. And I compared it to a writing task they'd done in their EAP course. And what I found was, they were using, there were none of the explicitly targeted learning outcomes from the EAP course that they didn't apply in this other task, but that they were applying them less. And this was things, I broke it into categories: content, organization, language use, and specific things like, do they organize, in the textbook they were told that they should organize their writing using an introduction, body, conclusion. They should state, in terms of content, they should state the personal significance of their writing. In terms of content, there were some other things like using compare and contrast structure. They were taught these different things in the book. And in fact, that book was the St. Martin's Guide, for those of you who might be familiar. So I just looked for specific things that had been targeted. And they did use a lot of that stuff, but they weren't using it in the same way that they were using in their in-class writing, in the EAP course. So, those are some examples of the stuff that they do transfer. But I think what the most important thing I've seen so far with this line of research is that while transfer does happen, it's definitely constrained because we're not seeing it happening in the same way when students do writing tasks outside the course. It's not happening in the same way that when they use those skills in their EAP writing course. Some sort of constraint. So what I want to do is continue doing this kind of stuff and try to identify factors that are influencing. Probably just about out of time. I think there may be another session here. But thank you very much. And if I can answer any other questions, please feel free to email me. You can get in touch with me through my ASU website. Thank you.